Olivia Johnson approached the luxurious beauty salon, highly regarded as the best in the city, with its eye-catching neon sign and intricately designed stained glass windows. She was filled with excitement, taking a moment to gather her courage before entering the salon. Inside, she was impressed by the artfully designed photo collages of various women's hairstyles, plush leather armchairs, chrome-plated handles, and spotless mirrors. The array of tools on the tables demonstrated the expertise of the salon employees. Maggie Salons, a hairdresser, greeted Olivia and inquired about her needs. Although Olivia expressed her desire for a haircut and color, Maggie warned her that the cost would be high, given the salon's reputation. Olivia hesitated but then confidently showed a magazine picture of the style she desired, assuring Maggie that she need not worry about the cost. Mrs. Johnson expressed her willingness to pay any amount of money for the desired haircut. She showed a page from her magazine to Maggie, the hairstylist, who raised her eyebrows and tried to hold back a malicious laugh. Maggie explained that the haircut was for young people and would not look good on Mrs. Johnson, who had sparse hair and a thin face. She advised Mrs. Johnson to choose something simpler and cheaper, but the old woman insisted on getting the desired cut and dyeing her gray hair. The other salon employees joined the conversation and began making fun of Mrs. Johnson, asking why she needed such a haircut and making inappropriate jokes. "Why do you even need such a haircut? Are you planning on sweeping your elderly husband off his feet?" Someone made a crack about Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson revealed that she did not have a husband and had been alone for over 10 years. The employees continued to mock her, leaving Mrs. Johnson feeling embarrassed and upset. After being rudely turned away from the high-end beauty salon, Mrs. Johnson left in a hurry, wiping her tears with a handkerchief. She walked across the square and discovered a humble hairdressing salon located on a quiet street. Despite its modest appearance, Mrs. Johnson was warmly welcomed by a kind and caring hairdresser named Nancy. When Mrs. Johnson showed her the same photo from the magazine, Nancy's eyes lit up with enthusiasm and she skillfully crafted the desired haircut, making Mrs. Johnson look even better than the photo. As a bonus, Nancy also dyed Mrs. Johnson's hair the color she had been longing for and even did her nails. Overwhelmed with gratitude, Mrs. Johnson thanked Nancy, calling her a magician and proclaiming this as the best birthday gift she could have received since she had just turned 70. As Nancy worked on her hair, she chatted with Mrs. Johnson, pouring her heart out to the attentive client. Mrs. Johnson learned that Nancy was an orphan who had taken hairdressing courses a few years ago, and Mrs. Johnson was touched by her kind and compassionate nature. Regrettably, Nancy had to support herself and her son on her own, living in a rented apartment and struggling to make ends meet. During their conversation, Mrs. Johnson discovered that Nancy's husband had left her and their child 5 years ago, while her mother was bedridden and under her care. John, Nancy's husband, was a freelance construction worker who traveled across states for work. Months after John left for a new project up north, Nancy received a cold letter from him, confessing that he had found a new love and started a new family. Devastated, Nancy refused to believe it, but her husband never returned. Her mother's health deteriorated rapidly, and she passed away 2 months after learning about her son's betrayal. Unable to bear the memories of her old home, Nancy locked it up and moved to another city, where she found work in a small hair salon. Although the pay was low, Nancy was hopeful about the future. After thanking Nancy for her kindness and hearing her touching life story, Mrs. Johnson decided to walk to the supermarket to treat herself to something delicious for her 70th birthday. However, before she could even take a dozen steps, she was greeted by a former student, Kate Simmons. Kate invited Mrs. Johnson to celebrate her birthday at a restaurant and surprised her by bringing her to the same elite beauty salon that had denied her services earlier. It turned out that Kate had become a successful businesswoman and actually owned the salon. She introduced Mrs. Johnson to the staff, who didn't immediately recognize her since her appearance had noticeably changed since they last saw each other. When Mrs. Johnson arrived at the salon, Maggie greeted her warmly, but soon turned away when their eyes met. Kate, anxious to hear Mrs. Johnson's thoughts on the salon, was growing increasingly impatient. Mrs. Johnson sensed Kate's eagerness and expressed her opinion on the staff's lack of compassion and decency. As she spoke, a tear ran down her cheek, and she made her way to the door. Kate followed her and took her into her office to listen to her story. After Mrs. Johnson had calmed down, she recounted the morning's events. Kate listened intently and then left the office. She gathered her employees and informed them that they were all fired for their unprofessional behavior. The employees left the salon, coming to terms with their sudden unemployment. Kate then phoned her classmates and organized a dinner party to celebrate Mrs. Johnson's birthday, which was a joyous occasion for all. It's worth saying that the celebration was wonderful. And the woman of the day hadn't felt so happy in a long time. Kate offered Nancy the position of a senior hairstylist at her salon the next morning, as per Mrs. Johnson's recommendation. However, Nancy's good fortune didn't end there. On that memorable day, Olivia Johnson invited Nancy and her son to live with her. At first, Nancy thought it was all just an incredible dream where anything was possible, and she feared that as soon as she opened her eyes, the magic would disappear into a fog. But no matter how much she rubbed her eyes, the pleasant reality remained. Additionally, Mrs. Johnson, who had no close relatives, drew up a will, stating that after her death, all her savings and the house would go to Nancy. Nevertheless, the orphan girl, who considers Olivia Johnson to be her family, prefers not to dwell on the possible inheritance. Instead, Nancy prays to God every day for her patron's health and long life.